Welcome to Land of Horror, where horror stories come to life like never before. In today's video, we will explore chilling true events, unsolved mysteries, and the fears lurking in the shadows. From bone-chilling murder cases to supernatural phenomena that defy all explanation, each story will take you on a journey filled with tension and suspense. You will hear about real individuals who have faced terrifying moments, life and death situations, and discoveries that send chills down anyone's spine. Prepare yourself for moments of anxiety and thrills, because these stories aren't just fiction, but the dark truths of life. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us in uncovering even more horrifying mysteries.
Anton Sokolov stood by the large window in his modest apartment, watching as the evening shadows slowly crept over the streets of Rostov. The town was calm, almost serene, but Anton's mind was far from peaceful. For years, he had lived a quiet, unremarkable life. A Russian literature teacher at the local high school, known for his intellectual demeanor and soft-spoken nature. But beneath this facade, there was something darker. Anton was meticulous in everything he did. His lessons were well prepared, his interactions with colleagues polite, and his apartment clean and organized. However, his internal world was chaotic. Every day was a struggle to suppress the thoughts that constantly gnawed at him. Thoughts of violence, domination, and control. These desires, once distant and abstract, had become an ever-present reality, pushing him toward an edge he had avoided for years. The people around Anton had no idea. They saw only what he allowed them to see. To them, he was an ordinary man, a good man. But in truth, Anton was at war with himself, and it was a war he was losing. It had been years since Anton first noticed the darkness within him. It began subtly, with small, intrusive thoughts that he could dismiss. But over time, these thoughts grew, fed by his frustrations with life, his students, and his inability to control his world. He had tried to quell these urges through various means, throwing himself into his work, engaging in meaningless relationships, and even isolating himself from others. But nothing worked. One particular student had caught his attention. Yulia, a bright-eyed girl of 15, always sat in the front row of his literature class. She was sharp, intelligent, and eager to learn, and something about her innocence called out to Anton. At first, he told himself it was admiration. He admired her potential, her hunger for knowledge. But soon, admiration turned into obsession. He began to think of her outside of class, imagining scenarios in which he could exert control over her, take what he wanted from her without question. These thoughts disgusted Anton. He knew they were wrong, but they also excited him in a way that nothing else did. The more he tried to suppress them, the stronger they became. One evening, after school had ended and the students had long since gone home, Anton lingered in his classroom. The building was quiet, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, almost unnatural. He stared at Yulia's desk, imagining her sitting there, her innocent eyes looking up at him, unaware of the darkness lurking just beneath his calm exterior. He didn't know how long he stood there, but when the janitor's footsteps echoed down the hallway, Anton snapped back to reality. He quickly gathered his things and left the school, feeling the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. On his way home, Anton stopped by a local park, a place where he often went to clear his mind. The park was nearly empty, save for a few people walking their dogs or jogging along the path. As he walked, he saw a young woman sitting alone on a bench, her face illuminated by the faint glow of her phone screen. Anton paused, watching her from a distance. His heart raced. and the familiar dark thoughts crept back into his mind. He could feel the urge rising within him, stronger than ever before. He wanted to approach her, talk to her, but more than that, he wanted to take control. He wanted to see the fear in her eyes, to feel the power that came with knowing he could do anything he wanted and no one could stop him. But he didn't. Not yet. He forced himself to walk away, his hands clenched into fists, his mind a battlefield of conflicting desires. Weeks passed, and Anton's obsession with Yulia only grew. He found himself lingering in the hallways, watching her as she interacted with her friends, always careful not to let anyone notice his gaze. He began to construct elaborate fantasies in his mind, each one darker and more twisted than the last. It was on a rainy afternoon, during one of his literature classes, that Anton made his decision. Yulia stayed behind after class to ask him a question about the day's lesson. Her friends had already left, leaving the two of them alone in the empty classroom. Anton smiled, his calm facade firmly in place, as he answered her question. But as she turned to leave, something snapped inside him. He couldn't let her go. Not now. "Yulia," he called out, his voice steady. "Could you stay for a moment? There's something I need to discuss with you." She hesitated but nodded, walking back toward him. Anton's heart pounded in his chest as he closed the classroom door, the soft click of the lock echoing in the empty room. What happened next was a blur of violence and fear. Anton acted on the dark impulses that had been building inside him for years. He overpowered Yulia, silencing her screams before they could reach anyone's ears. It was quick, brutal, and final. When it was over, Anton stood over her lifeless body, his mind reeling. He had done it. The thing he had fantasized about for so long was now a reality. But instead of feeling guilt or remorse, Anton felt a strange sense of calm. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Anton knew he had to be careful. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. He quickly cleaned up the scene, erasing any trace of what had happened. He carried Yulia's body out of the school under the cover of darkness, disposing of it in a remote part of the forest outside of town. For days after the incident, Anton was on edge, waiting for the police to come knocking at his door. But they never did. Yulia's disappearance was noted, and there was a brief investigation, but no one suspected Anton. He had played his role too well. He was just the quiet, unassuming teacher. No one could ever believe he was capable of such a thing. As the weeks went by, Anton's fear began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of confidence. He had gotten away with it, and if he had done it once, he could do it again. With each passing day, Anton's desires grew stronger. The thrill of taking a life had awakened something inside him, something primal and unstoppable. He began to seek out new victims, carefully choosing those who wouldn't be missed, those who were vulnerable and easy to manipulate. His methods became more refined, his killings more calculated. He used his position as a teacher to his advantage, gaining the trust of his victims before striking. Each time, he grew bolder, more confident in his ability to evade detection. But with each killing, Anton felt a part of himself slipping away. The man he had once been, the quiet, reserved teacher, was fading, replaced by something darker and more monstrous. He no longer cared about the consequences of his actions. All that mattered was the thrill of the hunt, the power he felt when he took a life. To the outside world, Anton Sokolov remained the same. He was still the dedicated teacher, the kind neighbor, the man who blended into the background. No one suspected that beneath his calm exterior, he was a predator, stalking his prey in the shadows. The police had no leads. They were dealing with a ghost, a killer who left no trace of his crimes. Anton was careful, always one step ahead, always watching, always waiting for his next opportunity. As the bodies piled up, the people of Rostov grew fearful. Rumors of a serial killer began to spread, but no one knew who to trust. Everyone was a suspect, but no one looked at Anton. He was invisible, hidden in plain sight. And so, the killings continued, each one more brutal than the last, each one fueling Anton's insatiable hunger for power and control. The darkness that had once been confined to his mind had now taken over his entire being, and there was no stopping it. A month had passed since Yulia's disappearance, but the quiet streets of Rostov had become a place of mounting dread. Missing person flyers still lined the walls of the school, and the local news covered her story regularly. Parents, once confident in the safety of their children, had grown increasingly paranoid. Curfews were implemented, and children were escorted to and from school by worried parents. Yet, despite the fear gripping the town, Anton Sokolov carried on as though nothing had changed. For Anton, this period of rising anxiety was intoxicating. Each day that passed without suspicion falling on him fed his confidence. He enjoyed the tension in the air, the way people whispered in hushed voices about the unknown predator lurking in their midst. Little did they know, the man they feared most was among them, quietly watching, waiting for his next move. Anton's demeanor in school remained calm, and his colleagues continued to see him as the reserved, somewhat distant teacher they had always known. But internally, Anton was constantly analyzing those around him, both the people who could become a threat to him and those he could manipulate. One evening, Anton found himself sitting in a dimly lit cafe, sipping black tea while observing the people around him. He often visited such places after work, blending into the background, becoming a mere shadow among the crowd. It was during one of these solitary evenings that he first noticed her, Anastasia, a shy, quiet girl who worked at the cafe. Anastasia was different from Yulia. She was older, in her early 20s, and lived a solitary life. Anton had observed her for several days now, noting her routines, her movements, and most importantly, her isolation. She had few friends and no close family in the area, making her the perfect target. Anton's decision to choose Anastasia was methodical, calculated. He knew that if he continued to target young girls from his school, he would eventually draw suspicion. Anastasia, however, was an adult, and her disappearance would not raise the same level of alarm. She was a perfect candidate for his next kill. As Anton watched her move about the cafe, clearing tables and serving customers, he felt the familiar stirrings of desire rising within him. The same dark thoughts that had consumed him with Yulia were now centered on Anastasia, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he acted on them. Anton spent the next few weeks carefully observing Anastasia, learning her habits and routines. He discovered that she lived alone in a small apartment near the outskirts of town, a fact that only increased his confidence in the plan he was devising. She worked late shifts at the cafe, often walking home in the dark, and Anton had already mapped out several locations along her route where he could strike without being seen. Anton had learned from his previous experience with Yulia. While that killing had been impulsive and driven by uncontrollable urges, this time he would be more careful, more deliberate. He knew the mistakes he had made, and he wouldn't repeat them. This time, there would be no room for error. He began visiting the cafe more frequently, always choosing a seat in the far corner where he could watch Anastasia without drawing attention to himself. He noticed that she was polite but distant, often avoiding eye contact with customers. She seemed tired, as though the weight of her solitary life had taken its toll on her. To Anton, this only made her more vulnerable. The plan was simple but effective. One night, when the cafe closed and Anastasia made her usual walk home, Anton would follow her. He would wait until she reached the quiet, isolated stretch of road near the woods that lined the outskirts of town. There, under the cover of darkness, he would make his move. The night Anton had chosen arrived. It was a cold, rainy evening, with a thick fog hanging over the streets, obscuring everything in a murky haze. Anton couldn't have asked for better conditions. The rain would wash away any evidence, and the fog would provide him with the cover he needed. He arrived at the cafe late in the evening, just as Anastasia was finishing her shift. He ordered a tea, sat in his usual spot, and waited. When she finally locked up and stepped outside, Anton slipped out of the cafe, keeping a safe distance behind her as she made her way down the dimly lit streets. Anastasia, oblivious to the danger following her, walked quickly, her head down to shield herself from the rain. Anton's heart pounded in his chest as he followed her, his mind focused solely on the task at hand. He knew that soon he would feel that same rush of power and control he had felt with Yulia. And this time, it would be even better because he had planned it so meticulously. As they reached the isolated stretch of road near the woods, Anton quickened his pace. The streetlights were dim here, casting long shadows that flickered in the mist. It was the perfect place to strike. Without a sound, Anton closed the distance between them. In one swift motion, he grabbed Anastasia from behind, covering her mouth with one hand while dragging her into the dense foliage of the woods. She struggled, but Anton was stronger, and the rain had made the ground slick, making it difficult for her to gain any footing. Anton had brought a knife this time, a sharp blade that he had kept hidden under his coat. As he pinned Anastasia to the ground, he could feel her panic, the fear radiating off her in waves. It was exactly what he wanted. He wanted to see the terror in her eyes, to feel her life slipping away beneath his hands. But before he could deliver the fatal blow, something happened. Anastasia, in a desperate attempt to free herself, managed to scratch Anton's face, drawing blood. The pain was sharp and unexpected, and for a brief moment, Anton hesitated. That hesitation was all Anastasia needed. With a sudden burst of strength, she kicked Anton hard in the stomach, knocking him off balance. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her screams echoing through the trees. Anton's mind raced as he watched Anastasia disappear into the fog. This was not how it was supposed to go. He had planned everything so carefully, and now it was all falling apart. He couldn't let her escape. If she made it to safety, she would tell the police, and they would come for him. Ignoring the pain in his stomach and the blood dripping down his face, Anton took off after her. His boots pounded against the wet ground as he ran, the branches of the trees tearing at his coat as he pushed through the undergrowth. But Anastasia was faster than he had anticipated, and the rain and fog made it difficult to see. She was already too far ahead, and Anton knew that if he didn't catch her soon, he would lose her completely. For the first time since this dark journey had begun, Anton felt fear, real, palpable fear. Not the fear of getting caught, but the fear of losing control, of failing in his twisted mission. He pushed himself harder, running faster than he ever had before. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning with exhaustion, but still, he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Finally, he saw her, just a glimpse of her figure through the fog, her pale face illuminated by the faint glow of a distant streetlight. She was almost at the edge of the woods, almost free. Anton's mind raced as he considered his options. He had one last chance to stop her. With a surge of desperation, he pulled the knife from his coat and threw it with all his strength, hoping to strike her down before she reached safety. The blade flew through the air, cutting through the fog in a deadly arc. But in his panic, Anton's aim was off. The knife missed its mark, embedding itself in the ground just inches from Anastasia's feet. With a final scream, Anastasia broke free of the woods and ran toward the nearest house, pounding on the door for help. Lights flickered on inside, and moments later, the door swung open, revealing a startled homeowner. Anton froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't go after her now. It was over. Anastasia was safe, and he was out of time. Anton retreated into the shadows, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. He had failed. Anastasia had escaped, and now she would tell the police everything. It was only a matter of time before they came for him. But Anton wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't afford to panic. He needed to think, to come up with a plan. There was still a chance he could salvage the situation, but it would require careful planning and execution. He wiped the blood from his face and slipped back into the fog, disappearing into the night. Anton Sokolov had spent the past week in a state of heightened paranoia. Since the night of Anastasia's escape, he had retreated further into his isolated world. Every sound in the street seemed louder, every glance from his colleagues more suspicious. His once impenetrable control was slipping, and for the first time in his life, Anton was terrified. The next day, when the news broke about Anastasia's harrowing escape from an unidentified attacker, Anton felt his stomach turn. The police were now involved, and they were combing the area where he had tried to strike. He knew they would be looking for clues, and he prayed that in his panic, he had left nothing behind that could connect him to the crime. Despite the overwhelming sense of dread that filled him, Anton went about his daily routine as if nothing had changed. He still taught his classes, still attended faculty meetings, and still went to the same cafe for his evening tea. But internally, he was in turmoil. Every moment felt like it could be the one that brought his life crashing down. Detective Pavel Ivanov had seen many cases of violent crime during his career, but the attempted abduction of Anastasia had shaken him to the core. The brutality of the attack, combined with the fact that it had taken place in the quiet town of Rostov, was deeply unsettling. Anastasia's account of the attack was chilling. She described her assailant as calm, methodical, and terrifyingly efficient. She hadn't seen his face clearly in the fog and rain, but she remembered the cold, calculated way he had tried to overpower her. It was clear to Ivanov that this was not the man's first attempt. There was a sense of experience in the way he had carried out the attack, as though he had done it before. Ivanov and his team scoured the crime scene, but the rain had washed away most of the evidence. The only clue they found was the knife Anton had thrown, a standard kitchen blade, with no fingerprints or identifying marks. Still, Ivanov was certain that this wasn't an isolated incident. There was something more to this case, something darker lurking beneath the surface. The detective began looking into other disappearances in the area, particularly the unsolved case of Yulia, the young girl who had vanished without a trace. As he dug deeper into the files, he began to see a disturbing pattern. Missing girls, all young, all seemingly vanishing without a trace. And now, Anastasia had barely escaped becoming the next victim. As the investigation intensified, Anton found himself spiraling further into madness. His once meticulous nature had given way to a frantic sense of urgency. He had spent years honing his craft, perfecting his ability to blend into society. But now it felt as though everything was unraveling. The more the police searched for Anastasia's attacker, the more Anton retreated into himself. He stopped going to the cafe and began avoiding his colleagues altogether. His students noticed the change in him as well. His normally calm and controlled demeanor had been replaced by irritability and sudden bursts of anger. Despite his growing paranoia, Anton couldn't stop thinking about Anastasia. The fact that she had escaped him gnawed at his mind like a festering wound. He replayed the night of the attack over and over in his head, trying to pinpoint where he had gone wrong. Each time he thought about her, the desire to finish what he had started grew stronger. But he knew that now, more than ever, he had to be careful. The police were closing in, and if he made one wrong move, they would discover who he truly was. Detective Ivanov had uncovered something chilling during his investigation. There was a pattern, but it stretched further back than he initially thought. He began researching older cases, unsolved murders that had taken place over the past decade. The more he looked, the more he became convinced that Rostov had been the hunting ground of a serial predator for years. Ivanov decided to revisit the Yulia case with a fresh perspective. He pored over the files, examining every detail with new eyes. That's when he came across the name Anton Sokolov, a name that had appeared in several witness statements. Parents of students at the school had mentioned him, though never in a suspicious context. But now, with the information from Anastasia's attack, Ivanov couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about this teacher. He began looking into Anton's background. What he found was troubling. Anton's past was murky, with large gaps in his history that didn't quite add up. Ivanov knew he needed to look closer. Anton's life had become a waking nightmare. Every time he left his apartment, he felt as though someone was watching him. He could no longer trust the quiet anonymity he had once relied on. The police were still searching for Anastasia's attacker, and Anton knew it was only a matter of time before they connected the dots. The pressure became too much to bear. Anton began drinking heavily, numbing his anxiety with alcohol, as he tried to come to terms with the fact that his life, as he had known it, was over. He had no plan, no way out. The walls were closing in on him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But even in his most desperate moments, the urge to kill remained. It was the only thing that gave him a sense of control, a way to reclaim the power he felt slipping away from him. And so, despite the danger, Anton began planning his next move. He knew he couldn't stay in Rostov much longer. The police were too close, and it was only a matter of time before they came knocking on his door. But before he left, Anton needed to satisfy the dark urges that had consumed him for so long. Anton knew he had to be careful this time. He couldn't afford another mistake like the one he had made with Anastasia. He began scouring the streets late at night, searching for his next victim. It had to be someone who wouldn't be missed, someone whose disappearance wouldn't draw immediate attention. It was on one of these late-night prowls that he found her, an older woman in her 50s, walking alone through a deserted part of town. She was perfect. Anton followed her for several blocks, waiting for the right moment to strike. When the moment came, it was quick and efficient. Anton grabbed the woman from behind, pulling her into the shadows before she had a chance to scream. This time, there would be no hesitation. Anton's movements were precise, calculated. The woman's life slipped away in his hands, and for the first time in weeks, Anton felt a sense of peace. But that peace was short-lived. As Anton stood over the woman's lifeless body, a car drove past, its headlights illuminating the alley for a brief second. Anton froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Had they seen him? Would they call the police? He couldn't take any chances. Anton fled the scene, disappearing into the night. The next morning, the woman's body was discovered, and the town was thrown into a state of panic once again. The police knew they were dealing with a serial killer, and Ivanov was more determined than ever to catch him. As Ivanov continued to investigate, his suspicion of Anton Sokolov grew. He began looking into Anton's life more closely, interviewing his colleagues and students. The more he learned about Anton, the more convinced he became that this was their man. Ivanov obtained a search warrant for Anton's apartment, and what they found there was enough to confirm Ivanov's worst fears. Hidden in a drawer, they found a collection of disturbing drawings depicting scenes of violence and death. There were also several news clippings about the missing girls in Rostov, including Yulia. Ivanov knew they were close, but they needed more evidence to make an arrest. Anton had always prided himself on being one step ahead of everyone else. But now, for the first time, he felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. The police were closing in, and Anton knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him. He had made plans to leave Rostov, to disappear and start over somewhere else. But as he packed his bags, there was a knock at the door. When Anton opened it, he was met by the cold, determined eyes of Detective Ivanov. Anton Sokolov sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the metal table in front of him. He had been arrested the night before, following a sudden raid on his apartment. Detective Pavel Ivanov stood on the other side of the table, staring at Anton with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. The evidence against Anton was damning: disturbing drawings, news clippings, and tools that could be used for abduction. While there was no direct physical evidence tying him to the string of murders, Ivanov was convinced that Anton was the man they had been hunting for years. Anton remained calm, his face expressionless. He knew that in situations like these, the best course of action was to stay silent. But inside, his mind raced. He thought about the last few months, the failed attack on Anastasia, the woman he had killed to satisfy his urges, and the growing scrutiny of the police. He had always believed he was invincible, but now it felt as though the world was closing in around him. Detective Ivanov leaned in, his voice low and firm. "We know what you've done, Anton. It's just a matter of time before we find the missing pieces." Anton said nothing. While Anton remained in custody, Ivanov's team continued their search for concrete evidence that could link him to the murders. They combed through his apartment, examining every item, every surface. They searched his car, his personal belongings, and his computer. But despite their efforts, they found nothing definitive. No blood, no DNA, no clear connection to the victims. Ivanov grew frustrated. He knew Anton was their man, but without hard evidence, they couldn't hold him for much longer. The media was already circling the story, and the town of Rostov was gripped with fear. Everyone knew a killer was in their midst, but without proof, Anton could walk free. The detective doubled down, interviewing every person who had ever crossed paths with Anton, his colleagues, his students, his neighbors. The stories were eerily similar. Anton was quiet, reserved, and never raised any red flags. But there was something about him, something unsettling that people couldn't quite put their finger on. It was as though he had always been hiding in plain sight. As the days in custody dragged on, Anton began to unravel. The calm facade he had maintained for so long started to crack under the pressure. He had spent years meticulously planning each kill, controlling every aspect of his double life. But now, in the cold confines of the police station, his control was slipping. At night, alone in his cell, Anton was haunted by the faces of his victims. He could hear their screams, feel their fear. The memories he had once suppressed now flooded his mind, overwhelming him with guilt and terror. For the first time in his life, Anton was truly afraid, not of the police, but of his own mind. The urge to kill, which had once been a source of power and control, now felt like a curse. He couldn't escape it, even behind bars. He knew that if he were ever released, the compulsion would return, stronger than before. But for now, trapped in the interrogation room, Anton was powerless. Just as Ivanov's team was on the verge of despair, they received a breakthrough. A forensic analyst found something during the examination of Anton's car. A single hair lodged in the fibers of the trunk. It belonged to Yulia, the young girl who had disappeared years ago. The discovery reignited the investigation. With this new lead, Ivanov knew they were closing in. They brought in more forensic experts, hoping to find more traces of evidence that would link Anton to the other victims. Meanwhile, Ivanov returned to the interrogation room, this time armed with the knowledge of the hair. He laid it out in front of Anton, watching for any sign of a reaction. But Anton remained silent, his face still unreadable. Inside, however, he was panicking. He had been so careful, so meticulous. How had he missed something as simple as a hair? Ivanov leaned forward, his voice a whisper. "You made a mistake, Anton. We have Yulia's hair in your car. It's over." Anton's heart raced, but he said nothing. He knew the walls were closing in. As the evidence mounted, Anton's mental state deteriorated further. The constant pressure, the fear of being caught, and the memories of his crimes all weighed heavily on him. He had always believed that he could outsmart the police, that he was too clever to be caught. But now, he could feel the noose tightening around his neck. The other inmates in the holding cells sensed Anton's weakness. They whispered about him, called him names, and taunted him. Anton had never been a physically imposing man, and without his veneer of control, he was vulnerable. The isolation he had once craved now felt suffocating. In a moment of desperation, Anton considered confessing. He thought about telling Ivanov everything, about laying bare the horrors he had committed over the years. But he quickly pushed the thought aside. Confession was a weakness, and Anton had spent his life avoiding weakness at all costs. Instead, he resolved to stay silent. He would not give Ivanov the satisfaction of a confession. If they wanted to convict him, they would have to do it without his help. The town of Rostov was in a state of chaos. The media had gotten hold of the story, and Anton's name was splashed across headlines and news reports. People were terrified. Parents kept their children close, refusing to let them walk to school alone. The streets that had once been safe and familiar now felt dangerous, as though evil lurked around every corner. Some of Anton's former students were interviewed by the media. and their accounts painted a chilling picture. They spoke of his quiet demeanor, his strange habits, and the unsettling feeling they had when they were around him. No one had suspected him of being a murderer, but in hindsight, the signs seemed obvious. As the community turned against him, Anton's name became synonymous with evil. He was no longer the unassuming teacher. He was a monster, a predator who had walked among them for years without suspicion. The people of Rostov demanded justice, and they wanted it quickly. With the hair from Yulia's body serving as the key piece of evidence, the prosecutor's office moved forward with charges against Anton. They were building a case not only for her murder, but for the other victims as well. The trial was set, and it promised to be one of the most publicized cases in Russian history. Anton's lawyer, a grizzled defense attorney named Victor, tried to prepare him for the trial. Victor knew the evidence against Anton was overwhelming, but he also knew that without a confession, there was still a chance to poke holes in the prosecution's case. But Anton was difficult to work with. He refused to speak to Victor about the murders, maintaining his cold silence. Victor knew that Anton was hiding something that went beyond the evidence. There was a darkness in Anton's eyes that unsettled him, a sense that there were secrets lurking beneath the surface that no one had yet uncovered. As the trial date approached, Anton's life became a strange limbo. He was no longer in control of his fate, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. He spent his days in his cell, replaying the events of his life over and over in his mind. The faces of his victims haunted him, and the guilt he had suppressed for so long began to rise to the surface. Despite the mounting evidence against him, Anton refused to break. He had always believed in his own superiority, and he clung to that belief even as the world around him crumbled. But as the day of the trial grew closer, Anton felt something shift inside him. He knew that once he stepped into that courtroom, everything would change. The trial would lay bare his darkest secrets, and there would be no turning back. Anton Sokolov entered the packed courtroom under heavy guard, his face as expressionless as ever. The media frenzy outside the courthouse had reached a fever pitch, with reporters from all over the country, and even international news outlets, clamoring to cover the trial. Inside the courtroom, families of the victims sat in silent anticipation, their eyes fixed on the man accused of destroying their lives. The prosecutor, a sharp and aggressive figure named Mikhail Orlov, wasted no time in laying out the state's case. He spoke of the years of fear that had gripped Rostov, the lives shattered by the mysterious disappearances and brutal murders, and the mounting evidence that pointed to Anton as the Rostov Ripper. Orlov painted a vivid picture for the jury, detailing how Anton had lured his victims, murdered them, and covered his tracks with chilling precision. As he spoke, the courtroom grew tense, the reality of the crimes becoming all too clear to those in attendance. Anton remained silent, his cold gaze never wavering. One by one, the families of the victims took the stand. Each testimony was a dagger in the heart of the courtroom, the grief and anger palpable. Parents spoke of the children they had lost, their voices cracking as they recalled the last time they saw their sons and daughters alive. Siblings shared memories of the ones they grew up with, stolen from them by the hands of a predator. The most heart-wrenching testimony came from the mother of Yulia, the girl whose hair had been found in Anton's car. She broke down in tears as she described the years of not knowing what had happened to her daughter, the nights spent hoping against hope that she would return. Her sobs echoed in the silent courtroom, and even the most hardened of onlookers were moved by her pain. Anton's expression remained unreadable. But inside, he felt the weight of the family's grief. He had always seen his victims as objects, as tools for his own twisted desires. But now, hearing the devastation he had caused laid bare, even he could not fully suppress a flicker of guilt. As the prosecution rested its case, Victor, Anton's defense attorney, took the floor. Victor knew that the evidence against his client was overwhelming, but he was determined to fight for every inch. His strategy was simple: cast doubt on the reliability of the forensic evidence and question whether Anton was truly capable of such atrocities, given his seemingly mild-mannered nature. Victor called character witnesses to the stand, former colleagues, neighbors, and even a few students. They all described Anton as quiet, introverted, and harmless. Some even expressed disbelief that the man they had known for years could be capable of such heinous crimes. The defense's case was thin, but Victor pressed on, determined to show the jury that there were gaps in the prosecution's narrative. He argued that the forensic evidence, while damning, was not conclusive enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Anton had committed the murders. Anton remained silent throughout the defense's case, his eyes focused on the floor. He knew that no amount of testimony or legal maneuvering could erase what he had done. But he was determined not to confess, to hold on to whatever shred of control he still had. Just as it seemed the defense might succeed in planting seeds of doubt, the prosecution delivered a devastating blow. A witness had come forward, a young woman who had narrowly escaped Anton's grasp. She had been too terrified to speak out before, but with Anton now on trial, she felt compelled to share her story. The woman, trembling as she took the stand, recounted how Anton had approached her on the street one evening, offering her a ride. At first, he seemed kind, unassuming, but as they drove, his demeanor changed. He became cold, menacing. She described how she had managed to escape by throwing herself out of the moving car, running for her life. Her testimony was a turning point. It was the first time anyone had heard directly from someone who had survived an encounter with Anton. The jury listened in stunned silence, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Anton's cold facade finally cracked. For the first time, he looked visibly shaken. He had always believed he was untouchable, that no one would ever be able to connect him to his crimes. But now, with this witness's testimony, his carefully constructed world was collapsing. In the days following the young woman's testimony, Anton began to unravel. The pressure of the trial, the weight of the evidence, and the realization that his fate was no longer in his hands took a toll on his fragile psyche. He stopped sleeping, haunted by nightmares of his victims. He began to hear their voices, whispering in the darkness, accusing him of the horrors he had inflicted. In the courtroom, he became erratic. He mumbled to himself, his once cold and calculating demeanor now replaced by a manic energy. Victor tried to keep him calm, but it was clear that Anton was losing control. The man who had once been so methodical, so careful, was now a shell of himself. The media seized on Anton's mental collapse, speculating about whether he might attempt an insanity defense. But it was too late for that. The prosecution had already made their case, and the jury had seen enough. After weeks of emotional testimony, forensic evidence, and legal arguments, the jury was sent to deliberate. The world held its breath, waiting to see if justice would be served. The families of the victims sat in tense silence, hoping for closure, but fearing the possibility of a not guilty verdict. The jury returned after only a few hours. The foreman stood, holding the piece of paper that would seal Anton's fate. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom, and a wave of relief washed over the families. Anton Sokolov, the man who had terrorized Rostov for years, would finally pay for his crimes. He sat motionless, his face a mask of defeat. There would be no escape, no last-minute reprieve. The judge sentenced Anton to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, haunted by the memories of the lives he had taken. The trial may have ended, but the scars left by Anton's reign of terror would never fully heal. The families of the victims continued to grapple with their grief, knowing that while Anton had been brought to justice, their loved ones were gone forever. In Rostov, life slowly began to return to normal. The streets, once empty and filled with fear, were now bustling again. But the memory of the Rostov Ripper lingered in the minds of the townspeople. It would be years before they felt truly safe again. For Detective Ivanov, the case was bittersweet. He had spent years hunting Anton, determined to bring him to justice. And yet, even with the trial over, Ivanov couldn't shake the feeling that there were still unanswered questions. How had Anton managed to evade capture for so long? How many more victims might there be, buried in unmarked graves, their names lost to time? Ivanov returned to his office, the weight of the case still heavy on his shoulders. He knew that Anton's story was far from over. There would be more investigations, more interviews, and perhaps even more victims to uncover. But for now, at least, the nightmare had ended. In prison, Anton was a shadow of his former self. The control he had once exercised over his life was gone, replaced by the rigid routine of prison life. He was kept in isolation, away from the other inmates, who would have gladly killed him if given the chance. He spent his days in silence, staring at the walls of his cell, haunted by the faces of his victims. The power he had once felt, the thrill of the hunt, was now replaced by a crushing sense of emptiness. He had always believed that he was superior, that he was in control. But now, in the cold light of reality, he saw himself for what he truly was, a broken man, consumed by his own darkness. In the end, Anton died alone in his cell, his body found by the guards during a routine check. There was no note, no final confession. Just a man who had once terrorized a city, now reduced to nothing. Years later, Rostov had begun to heal. The memory of Anton Sokolov had faded, replaced by new stories, new lives. But the scars remained, a reminder of the darkness that had once gripped the city. The families of the victims visited their loved ones' graves, finding solace in the fact that the man who had taken them was gone. Detective Ivanov retired, his career defined by the case that had consumed so many years of his life. But even in retirement, he couldn't forget Anton. The case would stay with him, a shadow that would follow him for the rest of his days. And so, life in Rostov went on. The city had faced its darkest days and emerged on the other side, scarred but unbroken.